Investigative reporting students of the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism and editors of the Riverdale Press have worked together to find that despite efforts to separate the courthouse from politics, the ties between the two still remain. Here now to share more about their story are Kate Pastor, editor of the Riverdale Press, Adam Wisnieski, who is the associate editor of the Riverdale Press, and Lindsay Armstrong, graduate of the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. And thank you all for sharing. And this was an investigative partnership. And were you surprised with your findings? Let me start there.
Go ahead, Kate.
This is something that the Riverdale Press hadn't really looked into at all before, and definitely was surprised about the sort of how widespread, at least what seems to be political patronage is in Bronx courtrooms. And
Right.
so, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, a decade ago they made all these rules to try to stop politicians from having a big play in the courtrooms, and then it continued. They found ways around it. Politicians always, they're smart. They found ways around a lot of the rules. So we were surprised to see that it was still going on, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about politics playing out in the courtroom, somebody who's just watching, let's give them an understanding of your findings and what your article turned up.
So there are, in certain cases, civil cases, there's a third party that's appointed to care for either a vulnerable individual as a guardian, a foreclosed property, oftentimes a person or property in a vulnerable position, and a third party is chosen by the court to take care of them, to oversee whatever the case is. And they are given lists of approved fiduciary appointees that they can choose from. And what ends up happening a lot of times is that there are politicians who are also lawyers who are on these lists, and they tend to rise to the top of the pile, getting more appointments than just a lawyer who may happen to be on that list. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, like I said, they do a great job, and other times it seems that their poor performance is ignored because of their political position.
More specifically, who are some of the key names that we're seeing coming out of this?
We did stories on Assemblyman Jeffrey Dinowitz from Riverdale, Lorraine Coyle-Capel from Riverdale as well, who didn't actually have any, a lot of problems with her things. Just she made a lot of money, and she's very politically connected. Also, Jeff Klein, who's very prominent in Albany. Who else do we have? Those are some of the big names. The big politicians' name, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And one of the judges was Malave Gonzalez, who's now the surrogate in the Bronx.
And upon contact, what are you hearing in your interviews from these people?
Well, I would just add to what Kate was saying earlier. I think one aspect of the patronage is that because judges are elected, they're often affiliated with political parties who help them to get on the ballot, and so there's sort of this conflict there between them appointing people who are also a part of the political party. And so that was one of the things that we sort of focused on in our interviews. It was, there were quite a few reporters working on the project, so maybe more specifically, is there a certain one that you're interested in?
Well, not a certain one, but I'll ask about receivership, because I know this is something that you really worked on. Give us a little bit about that, because that was pretty big too.
Sure. So receiverships are sort of a guardianship of a foreclosed property, and often these properties are in disrepair when they go into the receivership, and they're in financial straits as well. The court appoints someone to sort of act as a landlord, collect rents for the building, pay bills, and also to make sure it's maintained in a livable condition. I focused on someone named Howard Vargas, who he's not a political figure in a public way, but he's very affiliated with the party. He's had various positions in the Bronx Democratic Party over the years, and now serves as their lead counsel. And he received 15% of all receivership appointments between 2007 and 2011, even though there are 500 people almost who are qualified to receive these positions. And in addition, several of the buildings that we looked at had really fallen into further disrepair. I think it was 5 of his buildings that ended up on the city's alternative enforcement program list, which basically looks at the 200 worst buildings in the city each year while he was the receiver of them. So there are real people on the other end of this who are affected by people possibly not doing a good job and just getting sort of a political nod and then not really knowing how to handle the position. And there are other people who really are qualified that aren't receiving those appointments.
And given what we've seen happen with Malcolm Smith and things of that nature, obviously it becomes a whole lot more magnified. What do you think this means for us here in our borough with what we've got going on with your findings?
Well, I think what we found is that there was a real effort for reform in 2003, but that the enforcement perhaps isn't strong enough. So, you take State Senator Jeff Klein and his law partner Dominic Calderoni, and there were limits put in place for how much an individual can earn in order to prevent some of this patronage, and they were able to sort of use a tag team approach to, when one person capped out, say, hey, why don't you appoint my partner, while the other still did the work. So I think, for instance, strengthening, making it very clear that the law is meant for an individual, and that when somebody is appointed, that individual is to do the work. That's one of the reforms that I could see coming out of this.
Well, we'll talk about the partnership, because there has been a collective partnership and you guys have been working together. Give a little bit about the background as to how this got going and how you guys really were able to come together.
So the CUNY Investigative Journalism class, led by Tom Robbins, who he's a journalistic pro and Village Voice forever. You probably know him. He taught the class. 15 kids in the class, and the Riverdale Press. We have a very small staff. We have there's 4 of us on our editorial staff, so we don't get to do a lot of these really big investigative pieces that we would love to do, and so we just don't have the resources. So whenever we have the opportunity to work with anyone to really do a lot of the grunt work. They did a great job. They dug through tons of court documents. We're running around the whole city, going to courthouses, interviewing everybody, and brought it all together. And we fact-checked a lot of it. We tried to help them with some of the Bronx connections. And at the end of it all, it was we kind of focused it on 4 stories and brought it together. And I can't say enough about how great a job they did. They did a lot of good work.
What's been the feedback for you, given the fact that you kind of have ruffled some feathers here and went up got up under the cap? What's the feedback been like?
Well, we've been hearing some crickets from some political offices. I think that's maybe as far as I'll go, but we definitely get the sense that this hit a tender spot, and and obviously that's the role of reporting and investigative journalism. So. What we do hope is to see some more reforms. Just speaking to the shoe leather, one thing that the students turned up was that these documents were much harder to get. The documents that were actually looked at to come up with the stories are much harder to get in the Bronx than any other borough.
Really?
And that's one thing that we would definitely like to see sorted out and change, because on the books we're allowed to see these documents, but
freedom
for some
of information
reason
allows you to get that, but
for some reason they were originally sealed in the Bronx. So.
Really?
And that's the only borough in which they're sealed.
And they weren't in 2006. So something, instead of moving toward transparency, in certain cases, we seem to be moving backwards. So we'd certainly like to see that change.
So, of course, a quest for reform here.
I think another reform I would like to see that came up with receiverships, a lot of tenant advocacy groups and other groups are working with the Office of Court Administration to develop a list of approved receivers, almost like responsible developers. And the courts seem very open to it, really putting people in who know how to manage troubled property, so that people who have been paying their rent kind of don't become the victims of this system in which landlords were the ones who were irresponsible and possibly banks were the ones who were irresponsible.
Yeah. Can you give us a little bit more of the fallout for a person that's doing the right thing? Because obviously on the other side, you got these people who are doing, who are doing a wrong, but how is the tenant actually victimized in this whole process?
So one of the buildings that we looked into and that the Riverdale Press sent a second report or two to kind of update was on Creston, and I mean, people had rat and roach infestations, bathroom ceilings that were falling in, literally a front door that did not have a lock on it, the front door to the street. So people were coming in and occupying apartments, using them for drug use. I mean, really safety conditions, hazardous kind of health conditions. And unfortunately, that's not that uncommon. And so a lot of times people will stop paying their rent because the conditions in the building are so poor. And also because when a receiver comes in, people have been told before, oh no, you still pay me, the landlord. And then they find out, no, they're supposed to pay the receiver. They've had other groups come in and fraudulently claim to be the receiver because the receiver's not very present. And so they've lost money. Some receivers haven't applied for Section 8 housing grants, which are hundreds of thousands of dollars that they could be using to help maintain the building. So it's really taken a toll on these people's daily lives.
When you looked at your research into this, what was the biggest thing that really stuck out for you in this whole story?
I think, again, just the fact that there was this effort to put reforms in place, and that there just seems to be very little oversight in terms of enforcement. And how easy it is for that to slip through the cracks unless you have, a group of reporters really digging into it. And that, the fact that this has gone on for, a decade since reform, and that you have conditions, such as this building on Crescent Avenue that was under the receivership of Howard Vargas. I found, Lindsay's reporting on that particular building particularly shocking.
For me, I guess the most shocking thing was I was looking at the rules, and in the rules it says that the head of a political party of any borough can't get any appointments. So Carl Heastie can't, he's the head of the Bronx Democratic Party, he can't get any appointments. It's against the law. So he doesn't. I mean, he's not a lawyer, but he wouldn't anyway. But the second in command, Jeffrey Dinowitz, can do it. And a decade ago they discussed maybe having all elected officials, high up elected officials, not being able to get any appointments. And it's so funny that the rule stops that short. Heastie can't do it, but everybody else in the party can. And they're very powerful and influential just as much as he is. So.
Certainly something that we'll be keeping our eyes on, and thank you for coming and sharing with us and breaking this. Is this the beginning of a few series that we might be seeing, or
I think there might be some follow-ups.
There might be some follow-ups. All right, well, we'll have you back. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you so
coming and
much.
sharing with us.